swift as the wind and untouchable as moonlight, Artemis is the eternal huntress, guardian of the wild and avenger of any who dare defy her. Tonight, step into the legends with a calming voice specifically selected to help you fall asleep. Stay until the end, and if you enjoy the hunt, make sure to subscribe for more tales of the gods. Leto, daughter of Koios, was joined in love with Zeus, the ruler who held the mighty Aegis, and from their union she bore 2 radiant children, Artemis, delighting in arrows, and her twin brother Apollo, children whose beauty and grace were counted above all the sons of heaven. Blessed Leto, honored among goddesses, gave birth to her glorious children, Apollo, lord of the lyre and the bow, and Artemis, the huntress, whose arrows never missed their mark. She brought Artemis forth in Ortygia, and Apollo in the rocky island of Delos, places forever touched by divine memory. Leto, neat-ankled and noble, bore these twins who were supreme among the immortals in both thought and deed, their minds sharp as their skills, their presence commanding reverence from gods and mortals alike. Delos, the heaven-built isle, daughter of the sea and marvel of the earth, was the place that received the footsteps of Leto in her time of greatest need. Once this isle had drifted upon the dark blue sea, tossed endlessly by whirling winds, unable to find rest. But when Leto, in the frenzy of her imminent labor, set foot upon its soil, the island was stilled by the will of fate. From the roots of the earth, 4 lofty pillars rose, unshakable in their adamantine bases, lifting the rock to hold it firm, so that there she could give birth in safety. In this sacred place she brought forth her blessed children, the golden-haired Apollo, lord of music and light, and Artemis, the deer-shooting huntress, wielder of the bow, who held great power over women. Yet the path to this birth was not free of struggle, for Hera, jealous and unyielding, pursued Leto over all the earth, hounding her from land to land so that she might find no rest, no place to bring forth her children. Driven on by this divine wrath, Leto wandered across sea and shore until at last she came to Delos, where fate had destined her trial to end. There Artemis was born first, and even as a newborn, she displayed her nature and her strength, for she helped her mother in the birth of Apollo, easing the labor and guiding him into the light. From her first moments, Artemis became the practiced huntress, swift in the chase, and made the vow to remain ever a virgin. Her bow and arrows her constant companions. The Moirai themselves had ordained her role at the moment of her birth, decreeing that she would be the helper of women in childbirth, for her mother had known no pain in bearing her. Leto had carried her without travail, and so Artemis, born without the agony that so often accompanied birth, became the one to bring relief to others. In Ortygia, she first saw the light, her form already graceful and strong, her spirit bound to the wild places and the creatures that dwelled within them. Apollo, born in Delos with its lofty mountains, shone with golden radiance, but Artemis carried the silver glow of the moon in her presence, and together the twins were a harmony of light and hunt, music and chase, prophecy and protection. The hymn of Orphic praise named Leto as the dark-veiled, much-invoked queen, the twin-bearing goddess whose children were the pride of Olympus. From her came Phoebos, the god of light, and Artemis fair, whose winged darts delighted her and whose hand never faltered in the draw of the bow. Though the gods honored both, Artemis was marked forever as the one who walked the forests, who guarded the young, and who guided women through the trials of birth. Her beginning was a tale woven with the threads of divine love, relentless pursuit, and the stilling of a restless island by the touch of a goddess. Her name, from that moment, was spoken with reverence across the mountains, the meadows, and the moonlit groves, for she had come into the world not in the comfort of still halls, but in the open wild, beneath the pillars of the earth and the watching stars, ready from her first breath to walk her chosen path. Fair Xanthos' stream, known to mortals through the will of Leto, the bride of Zeus the Thunderer, flowed over the land, where once the stony plain of Lycia had been torn open by her own hands in the agony of labour when she brought forth in bitter pangs her children of divine birth, Apollo and Artemis. From ancient times, even in the age of the heroes, Delos was held in deep reverence for its gods, for it was there, as the story was told, that Leto at last found rest and gave birth to her children. Before that moment, the island had been tossed endlessly upon the waves, driven by the blasts of all manner of winds, never still upon the sea. But when Leto, daughter of Koios, came in the frenzied pains of childbirth and set her foot upon its soil, 4 great pillars, rooted deep in adamant at the foundations of the earth, rose straight upward and on their capitals bore the rock high above the waters, holding it firm. Upon this island she gave birth and beheld her blessed offspring, the divine twins whose names would be spoken across all lands. Yet Delos was not alone in claiming this honour, for along the coast of Ephesos lay Ortygia, a grove rich in all manner of trees, cypress above all, through which flowed the clear stream of the Kentrios river. Here, it was said, Leto bathed herself after her labour, and here lay the sacred place of the birth, the spot where the nurse Ortygia was honoured, and the olive tree under which the goddess first rested when she was freed from her travail. Above the grove rose Mount Solmissos, where the Curetes, armed and shouting, made a great clamour with their weapons to distract and frighten Hera, who jealously watched for Leto, and thus they shielded her and concealed the birth of her children from the eyes of the queen of the gods. On her way to Delos, Leto passed through the place called Zoster in Attica, where there stood an altar to Apollo, to Artemis, and to Leto herself. There, though she did not give birth, she loosened her girdle in preparation for her delivery, and from this act the place took its name. Among the Eleans, Artemis was called Elaphia, which some believed came from her hunting of deer, yet they themselves told that Elaphios was the name of a woman of their land who had reared the goddess. In Athens, across the Ilissus River, lay the district of Agrai, where stood a temple of Artemis Agrotera, the huntress. For it was here, they said, that Artemis first hunted when she came from Delos after her birth, the chase marking her path from the first days of her life. Thus the places of her journey and the moments of her birth were remembered, each land holding some part of her story, whether it was the stilling of Delos in the midst of the sea, the shaded groves of Ortygia, the clamour of Mount Solmissos, the loosening of the girdle at Zoster, the name given by the Eleans, or the first hunt at Agrai, all bore witness to the coming into the world of Artemis, the huntress and protector, and to her twin, Apollo, the god of light, born in the same hour under the steadfast pillars that rose from the deep roots of the earth. Artemis, still a child yet already speaking with the resolve of one who knew her place and purpose, asked for attendants who would tend well her buskins, and when she no longer hunted lynx or stag, would care for her swift hounds. She asked for all the mountains to be hers, and for a city, she told her father he might assign whichever he wished, for she would seldom descend into the towns. The wild heights would be her home, and she would enter the cities of men only when women, suffering the sharp pangs of childbirth, called for her aid. Even at the hour of her own birth, the fates had ordained that she should be the helper of women, for her mother had felt no pain when she bore her, nor in the months she carried her. Without travail, she had been brought forth into the world. As she spoke these words, she reached out her hands, wishing to touch her father's beard in supplication. But her hands, though many times extended, could not reach it. Her father smiled at her request, and his head bent slightly in approval. He caressed her as he answered, telling her that when goddesses gave him children like her, he had little reason to heed the anger of Hera. He granted her all she asked and promised even more. He gave her 3 times 10 cities and towers beyond counting, cities that would glorify none but her and bear her name. And he named her the watcher over streets and harbours. Then he bent his head fully, sealing his promise. With his gifts assured, the maiden set out to gather her companions. She journeyed first to the white mountain of Crete, clothed in thick woods, where she took from the Amnesiades 20 nymphs to serve her. Then she travelled to the deep-flowing stream of Okeanos, from which she chose 60 of the Okeanides. All were 9 years old, all still maidens untouched by girdle. The river Kairatos rejoiced greatly at the honour, and Tethys herself was glad to see her daughters given as handmaidens to the daughter of Leto. These attendants would follow Artemis in her hunts, tend her hounds, and share in her life upon the high mountains, untouched by the dust of cities. When her attendants were gathered, Artemis set her mind upon her bow and arrows, the tools that would make her the huntress forever. She went straight to the island of the Cyclopes. In later days, men would call it Lipara, but at that time, its name was Melagunis. There she found the one-eyed smiths at the anvils of Hephaestus, standing in a circle around a great molten mass of iron. They laboured quickly, for they were making a horse trough for Poseidon. The nymphs who had followed Artemis were struck with fear when they saw the Cyclopes. The creatures were like great crags torn from the mountains of Ossa, their single eyes set beneath their brows, each eye as large as a shield of 4-fold hide, glaring fiercely from its place. The sounds that filled the air were heavier still, the ringing clash of metal upon metal as the anvils sang, the rushing roar of the bellows feeding the flames, and the deep guttural groaning of the Cyclopes as they worked. Their blows were in rhythm, the hammers rising above their mighty shoulders and falling upon bronze and iron that glowed red from the furnace. The earth and sea alike seemed to cry out with the noise, for Aetna gave its voice, and Trinacia, home of the Sicanians, roared in answer. Italia's shores echoed the din, and even distant Kyrnos joined the chorus, as if the land itself trembled at their craft. It was in this place, amid the fire, the ringing metal, and the unshakable strength of the Cyclopes, that Artemis sought the making of her bow and arrows. The daughters of Okeanos could not bear to look directly upon the Cyclopes, nor could they endure the crashing sound that thundered in their ears. This was no fault of theirs, for even the daughters of the blessed gods shuddered to look upon those mighty beings, so great was their form and so terrible their presence. Though the Cyclopes had long since passed the years of childhood, their strength and wild appearance inspired awe and dread alike. Yet Artemis, still so young, had shown no fear. When she was only 3 years old, Leto had carried her in her arms at the bidding of Hephaestus, who wished to give her the first gifts of her life. It was then that Bronte, one of the Cyclopes, took her and set her upon his strong knees. The child, fearless in spirit, reached out her small hands and grasped the thick, shaggy hair that covered the great chest of the giant, pulling with such force that she tore it away. Even to this day, the middle of his chest remained bare of hair, untouched by time, as if marked forever by her touch, as bare as a man's temples when sickness eats away the hair. Because of that early boldness, she addressed the Cyclopes without hesitation, asking them to fashion for her a bow of the Cydonian style from Crete, along with arrows and a hollow casket in which to keep her shafts. She declared herself a daughter of Leto, as was Apollo, and promised that if she should use her bow to bring down any wild beast or monstrous creature, the Cyclopes would have the right to eat the kill. Hearing her words, they did as she had asked, and the work was swiftly done. When the bow and arrows were given to her, Artemis arrayed herself, the huntress now armed for the life she would lead. With her weapons in hand, she set out to gather the hounds that would run beside her. She journeyed to the fold of Pan in Arcadia, where she found the bearded god cutting up the flesh of a lynx taken from the slopes of Mainalos, so that his bitches might eat. To Artemis, Pan gave a gift of his finest dogs, 2 black and white, 3 reddish in coat, and 1 that was spotted, fierce enough to seize the throats of lions and drag them alive back to the fold. Along with these, he gave her 7 hounds of the Kinnosurian breed, swifter than the winds themselves. These were the most skilled in pursuing the fawn and the hare whose eyes never closed, and in tracking the stag to its hidden lair. They could follow the path of the porcupine to its burrow and find the track of the gazelle, leading the hunt with unerring skill. Leaving Pan's fold with her new companions, Artemis and her hounds moved on until they came to the base of the Parrhasian hill in Arcadia. There, by the banks of the black-pebbled Anoros, she found a great herd of deer at play. They were unlike any others, for their size was greater than that of bulls, and their horns shone with the brilliance of gold. At the sight of them, she was filled with sudden wonder and thought to herself that such a prize would be a capture worthy of her name. There were 5 of these golden-horned deer, and she chose 4 of them to draw her swift chariot. With the speed of her own feet alone, without the aid of her hounds, she ran them down and took them. The 5th, however, escaped her grasp, leaping across the river Celadon through the will of Hera, who planned that this creature should one day become the quarry of Heracles. It fled to the slopes of the Cyrenian hill, and so it was lost to her. Yet the 4 she had taken became the proud steeds of her car, and she, the maiden untouched, the slayer of Tityos, stood in golden arms and with a golden belt, the huntress complete in her power. And a golden car you yoked, gleaming in the light, and with golden bridles you fastened the harness upon your deer, their antlers bright as the morning sun. They stood restless, their hooves striking the earth, ready to carry you forth. The first path they took beneath your hand was to the cold heights of Thracian Hymos, where the breath of Boreas sweeps down in bitter gusts, bringing a cruel frost to men without cloaks, the wind cutting like iron through their skin. From there, your chariot rolled onward, and your power grew with each place you passed. It was upon the slopes of Mysian Olympus that you cut the tall pine, shaping it for your torch. Into it you breathed the unquenchable flame drawn from the very bolts of your father, a fire that could sweep through the forest and never be put out. In your hands it was a weapon and a warning, a force as fierce as the storms in the sky. With your silver bow you began to test your skill, the strings singing beneath your fingers. Your first arrow found its mark in the trunk of an elm, the shaft quivering in its heart. The second struck an oak, deep in the core of its strength. The third was loosed at a wild beast, swift and certain, and it fell where it stood. But the fourth arrow was turned against a city whose people were unjust, those who sinned among themselves and towards strangers alike, whose pride and cruelty had grown without measure. Upon them your wrath descended, and the punishment was heavy. A plague swept through their cattle, leaving their pastures bare. Frost lay upon their fields, devouring the crops before the harvest. In their homes, the old men cut their hair in grief for the sons they had lost. The women suffered in childbirth, some perishing, others giving birth to twisted and crippled children, their ankles never straight. Yet to those who pleased you, whose lives were just and whose hearts were pure, you brought blessing in equal measure. Their fields yielded full ears of grain, their herds multiplied and grew strong, and all their work prospered. They buried only the aged, their lives free from the pain of untimely death. Strife did not tear their homes apart, and the poison of faction never touched them. Even in-laws lived together in harmony, the brother's wife and the husband's sister sharing the same table in peace. For these, your smile was a gift greater than gold, a sign that the goddess of the bow watched over their days. And for those who counted themselves your friends, they prayed always to be among that blessed number. In song, your labors were remembered. The marriage of Leto sung in clear voices, your name woven again and again into the verses. Alongside you in the music was Apollo, and with him all the deeds that marked your life, your hunts and your hounds, your bow and your shining chariot. The image of you driving in splendor to the house of Zeus, swift and bright, lived forever in the songs of those who praised you. When you came to Olympus, it was Hermes and Apollo who met you first at the gates. Hermes, the bringer of blessings, took from you your bow and quiver. Apollo received whatever wild beast you had brought from the hunt, taking them as his share. So it was until the coming of Heracles, the strong one from Tiryns, who now stands at the gates instead. He waits to see what prize you will bring, his eyes watching for the moment you arrive. The gods laugh to see him so eager, their laughter ringing loud, and none laugh more than the mother of his wife when he returns from your chariot with a great bull or a wild boar in his grasp, holding it by the hind leg as it kicks and struggles. With a smile, he tells you to aim your arrows at the fierce beasts that trouble mortals, so that they may call you their helper as they call him. He bids you leave the deer and hares to roam the hills, for the hunt of the goddess should be for those creatures whose destruction brings peace to humankind. The hills were left for the deer and hares to roam freely, for what harm could such creatures bring? It was the wild boars that tore through the tilled fields of men, uprooting crops and destroying plants, leaving the work of many seasons ruined in a single night. Boars were the ones that laid waste to the growing shoots, and even the oxen could be a scourge upon men's labor, their great strength a danger to the land they trampled. These, Heracles urged, were the beasts upon which to set her arrows, for such hunts brought true aid to mortals. And with that, he turned swiftly to his own task, busying himself with the great beast he had taken. For though his mortal flesh had been burned away beneath a Phrygian oak when he was raised to godhood, his hunger had not lessened in the least. Still he carried the same appetite, the same belly that had once driven him to meet Theodamus at the plough, his desire for feasts as enduring as his strength. For Artemis, the Amnesiades, nymphs of the stream of Amnisos, tended her chariot team with care. They rubbed down the hinds, freeing them from the yoke, their sleek flanks glistening in the light. From the meadows sacred to Hera, they gathered armfuls of the swift-springing clover that grew there. The same clover that was the favored food of the horses of Zeus himself, and they carried it to feed the deer. They filled golden troughs with fresh water, cool and clear, a pleasant draught for the horned creatures that drew her golden car. With her team tended and at rest, the goddess herself entered the great house of her father. The gods within, all alike, rose to greet her and bid her take a seat among them. But she took her place beside Apollo, her twin, as she had always done. Among the hymns sung in her honor came the invocations to the goddess, calling upon her name in praise of her might, her skill, and her purity. For Artemis was among the few whom even golden Aphrodite could not touch with the power of love. Aphrodite, whose beauty and allure stirred sweet longing in the hearts of gods and subdued the tribes of mortal men, could sway almost every being in heaven and on earth. Yet there were three whose hearts she could neither bend nor ensnare. First was Athena, daughter of Zeus, bright-eyed and wise, who held the aegis and found no joy in the works of Aphrodite. Next was Artemis, the huntress, whose golden shafts and bow were her delight, who roamed the mountains in pursuit of wild beasts, who loved the music of the lyre, the dance, the ringing of thrilling cries, the shadow of deep woods, and the company of upright men in their cities. The third was Hestia, the pure maiden of the hearth, who had no part in the bonds Aphrodite wove. All others among the gods and mortal men fell within her power, but these three stood apart. So it was that Eros, the loosener of limbs, never approached Artemis, for her heart was set upon her hunts and the freedom of her chosen life. From her earliest days, she had remained untouched, her skill with the bow growing as her years advanced, but her virginity never given away. In her childhood, while still small enough to sit upon the knees of her father, she had spoken to him and asked that her maidenhood be hers to keep forever. Her father had smiled at her request and bowed his head in assent, sealing the gift she sought. Like Athena and Kore, she chose the path of maidenhood, growing up in the company of those who shared her choice, bound by the same vow. Her resolve was known throughout the lands, and her wrath against those who would dishonor it was feared. Tales spread of the punishment she dealt to those who looked upon her without her consent, as in the story of the hunter who, seeing her unclothed, was struck down not by a blow but by transformation. His form changed into that of a stag, so that even his own hounds turned upon him. In all the mountains and forests, in the cities of men, and in the courts of the gods, Artemis was known as the virgin huntress, the goddess whose bow and arrows defended her freedom as fiercely as they struck down the beasts of the wild. Some believed the vengeance of Artemis to be harsh and undeserved, while others praised it as the rightful defense of her sacred purity, for she was steadfast in her virginity and guarded it fiercely. Even Aphrodite, the golden goddess of love, lamented to her son that both Pallas and Artemis, queen of the hunt, had turned from her domain, abandoning love entirely to keep their maidenhood. Many stories were told of those who sought to win her favor or her hand, and how they failed, some meeting her wrath like Orion, the Aloidae, Buphagus, and Actaeon, and some who sought her love in vain, like Alpheus, when Persephone later told her mother Demeter the story of her abduction. She spoke of that day in the meadow. She and her companions had been together in a place of beauty, a wide and lovely field where the grass was soft and the air was filled with the scent of flowers. With her were Leucippe, Phino, Electra, and Ianthe, and many other daughters of Okeanos, as well as Pallas, who stirs the hearts of warriors, and Artemis, who delights in her arrows. They moved together through the meadow, gathering the blooms that grew there in abundance: delicate crocuses, bright irises, rich hyacinths, roses in full colour, and lilies that shone white in the light. The flowers were so fair to see that their beauty seemed almost alive, and Persephone's hands were filled with them when her gaze fell upon a single bloom unlike any other, a narcissus that would draw her away from the safety of her friends and into the grasp of Hyde. In the temple of Demeter and Persephone at Megalopolis in Arcadia, the tale was remembered in stone. There, before the goddesses, were carved small maidens wearing tunics that fell to their ankles, each balancing upon her head a basket overflowing with flowers. Some said these figures were the daughters of Damophon, but others, looking to the deeper truth, believed they were Athena and Artemis themselves, shown at the moment they had been gathering flowers with Persephone before the dark chariot came. The story was told too by those who said that both Athena and Artemis, like Kor, had chosen maidenhood and grown together with her upon the island of Sicily. They had walked its hills and fields, gathering flowers side by side and working together to weave a robe for their father Zeus. The bond they formed in those days made them love the island above all other places, and in the dividing of lands by the gods, each received a portion for herself. Athena took the region of Hera, and Artemis was given the island of Syracuse, her share marked as her own by the will of the immortals. Some said that Zeus himself had commanded Hades to take Persephone, instructing him to seize her while she was among her companions upon Mount Etna in Sicily. On that day, she was not alone. Venus, Diana, and Minerva were with her, moving through the fields in peace, their hands full of blooms. But the stillness was broken when the sound of hooves and the grinding of wheels came near, and the chariot of Hades burst forth, drawn by 4 black horses, to carry her away into the depths below. In the telling of others, it was in the bright days of spring that Persephone, full of joy, led the dance upon the ridges of Hymettus, where flowers covered the slopes, or else beneath the cliffs of Sicily. She walked sometimes with Athena close on one side, and on the other hand with Artemis, taller than her companions and surpassing all in grace. But the music of her dance faltered, and the colour left her face when she saw the shadow of Avernus and the figure of Hades before her, and in that moment all the beauty of the day was turned to darkness. Beneath the dark and jagged rocks of Etna in Sicily, Artemis stood alongside bold Athena and the queen of the Elysian realm, Persephone, their presence shining among the nymphs of Enna. The meadow there was sacred, its beauty known to all, and the gathering of such goddesses gave it a light unlike any other. In the rites of the Eleusinian mysteries, Artemis was remembered not only for her hunts and her bow, but also for her role in the search for Persephone, when she walked beside Demeter through the lands of men and the wilds of the earth. In that time, she became a companion of the underworld goddess, her steps leading even into the shadowed paths of the dead. The Eleusinians called her by the name of Hecate, and though in later days Hecate would be honoured as a separate goddess, in those rites their forms and powers were closely bound. In the age-old war of the Titans, the peace of the heavens was shaken. Hera, seeing that Epiphus, son of a mortal mother, held a mighty kingdom, set her will against him and saw that he perished in the hunt. Then she turned to the Titans, urging them to rise against Zeus and drive him from his throne, to give the kingdom back to Kronos. The Titans gathered their strength and sought to climb to the heights of heaven. But Zeus, with Athena at his side, with Apollo and with Artemis, met them in their advance. The battle was fierce, but together they drove the Titans back, casting them down into the depths of Tartarus, where the darkness closed over them forever. When the war of the giants came and the sons of the earth rose in challenge to the gods of Olympus, Artemis took her place among the defenders. The ground shook beneath the tread of the gigantes, their weapons the size of trees, their roars echoing across the sky. Amid the clash, Artemis drew her bow, and her arrows flew straight and true. In that great struggle, she slew the giant Aegaeon, striking him down with shafts that no shield could turn aside. His fall was mighty, and the ground swallowed him as the gods pressed on in their victory. Yet there was a foe greater still, a threat to all the gods together. Typhoeus, born of the earth, whose strength was such that none could match him. He sought the throne of Zeus, and as he came in his rage, the gods felt fear take hold. One by one, they turned in flight, seeking to escape his path. Only Zeus and Athena stood their ground, but the others fled far across the sea to the land of Egypt. In their flight, they took on the forms of animals, disguising themselves from the monster's sight. Apollo became a hawk, Hermes took the form of an ibis, and Artemis changed into a cat, her sleek body and swift step concealing her divine power. In this form, she hid from the wrath of Typhoeus, who searched for them even in that distant land. The Egyptian priests remembered this tale and told how, in honor of that moment, the creatures that had once borne the forms of the gods were never to be harmed. To them, the cat was sacred, a living sign of the goddess who had once walked their land in that shape. The poets too recalled the story, telling of the day when the gods gathered in Egypt and the monster came upon them, and how each took another form to escape destruction. From the depths of the earth Typhoeus rose, his great body forcing its way upward until he stood beneath the open sky. His very presence struck terror into the hearts of the immortals, and they turned their backs upon him, fleeing in haste. Across the seas they came to the wide delta of the seven-mouthed Nile, thinking themselves safe at last. But Typhoeus, the earthborn foe, was not so easily turned aside, and even there in that far land he pursued them, his shadow stretching over the waters and the fields as he sought to bring the rule of Zeus to an end. The gods, fleeing from the monstrous Typhoeus, took on false shapes to hide themselves from his fury. Zeus became a great ram, lord of the herd, and so in later days he was shown by the Libyans as Ammon, wearing the curling horns. Apollo hid as a raven, dark-feathered and watchful. Dionysus took the form of a goat, swift and sure-footed, and Artemis became a cat, sleek and silent, her sharp eyes and quick movements masking the divine power within her. In these shapes they concealed themselves until the danger had passed. There was a time when the river god Alpheus sought Artemis with a desire that could not be turned aside. Knowing that gentle words and entreaties would not win her, he plotted to take her by force. At Letrinoi, in the land of Elis, Artemis gathered with the nymphs who were her companions, holding an all-night revel. The air was filled with the sound of their laughter and the movement of their dance. Into this gathering came Alpheus, intent on seizing her, but Artemis, suspecting his purpose, prepared herself with cunning. She smeared her own face with mud and did the same for each of the nymphs around her, so that all bore the same unrecognizable mask. When Alpheus entered the throng, he could not pick her out from the others. Confused and unable to carry out his plan, he turned away, leaving without his prize. On Olympus, the muses lifted their voices, one answering another in sweet harmony. The Graces, bright-haired, and the Seasons, full of cheer, danced hand in hand with Harmonia, Hebe, and Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, their wrists linked as they moved in unison. Among them stood Artemis, tall and noble in her bearing, her presence as enviable as it was striking, the sister of Apollo and the one who delights in arrows. The gods themselves joined in their sport, Ares with his restless energy, Hermes with his sharp eyes, while Apollo played his lyre stepping high, the light from his feet and his close-woven garments casting a radiance around him. Often Artemis journeyed to the great house of Apollo in the rich land of Delphi. There, in the sacred place, she led the dances of the Muses and the Graces. She would hang up her curved bow and quiver, setting aside the tools of the hunt, and take her place at the head of the circle. Gracefully she moved, her step guiding the others as they sang with voices that were not of mortal kind, filling the air with heavenly music. Pindar told of the festival of Dionysos, held by the gods in their halls near the throne of Zeus, in the presence of the mother of the gods. The timbrels began the prelude, their sound whirling through the air. Then came Artemis, the lone huntress, her presence light but commanding. In the revels of Dionysus, she had yoked the wild offspring of lions to his service, the beasts themselves moving as if caught by the spell of music, dancing at the will of the god. When Artemis returned to Olympus from Therapnae, where maidens dwelt, she came to her father and her brother. Her mother Leto met her on the way, walking beside her with pride. With her own hands, Leto adjusted the bow and quiver, set her daughter's robe in place, covering her shoulders and bare arms, and smoothed the tresses that had come loose. It was a moment of care and closeness, the mother taking joy in readying her daughter, proud to see her return from the places she loved, still bearing the strength and grace that marked her among all the gods. At the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, when the gods gathered to honor the bride whose beauty was matched only by her lineage, the air was bright with song and filled with the scent of rich offerings. At the bidding of Zeus, Ganymede, the cupbearer of the gods, poured the wine, moving among the gathered immortals with a vessel of gold. All the gods hastened to give honor to the white-armed bride, the sister of Amphitrite, who had come from the depths of the sea. From the heights of Olympus came Zeus himself, and from the rolling waters of the sea came Poseidon, each bearing gifts and blessings. Among them, though the wild places were her realm, came Artemis, the daughter of Leto and sister of Apollo, leaving the forests and the hunt to join the assembly. In the labors of Heracles, Artemis's presence and her will were felt more than once. Upon the sacred slopes of Delphi, in a work of art dedicated there, Heracles and Apollo were shown locked in a struggle for the tripod, the sacred seat of prophecy. They gripped it with equal strength, their faces set in determination. Beside them stood Leto and Artemis, each reaching to calm Apollo, while Athena restrained Heracles. In the stillness of the carved scene, the tension between the two heroes was caught, and the goddess's hands reached to keep the quarrel from spilling into full battle. In another labor, Heracles was ordered to bring back alive the Cerinician hind, a golden-horned deer sacred to Artemis. This creature roamed the wilds near Oinoe, swift as the wind and untouchable to mortal hunters. Wishing neither to kill nor to wound it, Heracles gave chase for a full year. Through forest and over mountain he pursued it, until at last the hind, wearied of the endless flight, fled to Mount Artemision. From there it crossed the waters of the Ladon River, the spray flashing around its legs. As it swam, Heracles loosed an arrow and struck it, not to kill, but to stop its run. He lifted the deer onto his shoulders and carried it quickly through Arcadia. Along the way, Artemis and Apollo appeared before him, reaching for the hind, Artemis rebuked him for harming her sacred creature, but Heracles spoke of necessity, telling her that the command had come from another and that he bore no malice toward the animal. His words softened her anger, and she allowed him to carry the deer to Mycenae still living. Among his other trials was the clearing of the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures that made their home around Lake Stymphalos. The lake was sacred to Artemis, and in its sanctuary, her image was kept, watching over the waters. Near the temple's roof, carved among other figures, were the birds themselves, their likeness preserved in stone. They were fierce in nature, their wings edged with bronze and their beaks sharp, a danger to all who came near. In the labor set to him, Heracles drove them from the lake, and in doing so, he touched upon the domain of the goddess once more. Another sacred beast lay in the land of Erymanthos, a great boar that ravaged the countryside of Arcadia. Like the Serenician hind and the Stymphalian birds, this creature too was among the animals linked to Artemis. It tore through fields, destroyed crops, and struck fear into the people of the region. Heracles was commanded to take it alive, and in the hunt for the boar, the wild, untamed realm of Artemis was again crossed by the path of his labors. The mountains echoed with the sound of its charge, and the snow-crusted slopes bore the marks of the chase. Each of these tasks, whether it was in the pursuit of a swift hind, the driving of deadly birds, or the capture of a raging boar, brought Heracles into the shadow of the goddess of the hunt, whose creatures moved through the wild places untouched by ordinary hands. Artemis the huntress ranged the wild slopes, moving over the mountainside with the swiftness of the wind, her bow never far from her hand. Sometimes she was seen on the lofty heights of Taygetos in Lake Daimonia, where the golden-horned Serenician hind roamed under her protection, its hooves light upon the rock and grass. At other times, she moved through the thick forests of Erymanthos in Arcadia, where the great boar made its lair, a creature fierce and untamed, feared by the people who lived in its shadow. Among the boars and the running deer, she took her pleasure, her step sure on steep ridges, and her eyes ever watchful for the movement of her prey. There came a time when her role reached beyond the hunt and into the fates of gods and mortals alike. On the cold heights of Olympus, Leto, with her children Apollo and Artemis, stood before Zeus in solemn petition. Their eyes were shadowed with concern, for they came to plead for the release of Prometheus, the Titan bound in unyielding chains upon the lonely rock of Caucasus. Apollo spoke for them, but Artemis stood by with grave and mournful gaze, her presence lending weight to the plea. He asked how long the great king would let the old one suffer, how long until another Heracles would come to end his torment. He spoke of the mountains themselves, weary with the burden of his cries, and of all humankind, who remembered the gift of fire for which he had been so punished. Zeus, moved by the tears of the goddesses and the high renown of Apollo, relented. He sent swift Iris down from the sky, her cloud glowing with rose and gold, with the command that Heracles should go and slay the dread bird that tormented Prometheus and set the Titan free. In the days of the Trojan War, the power of Artemis touched the fate of many. When the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, the winds fell still. The sea lay flat and unmoving, for Artemis had becalmed it in her wrath against Agamemnon. The seer Calchas spoke of her anger and declared that only the sacrifice of Agamemnon's eldest daughter, Iphigenia, would appease her. So the warriors waited while a father faced the command of the goddess, knowing that without her favor, the war could not begin. In the battles that followed, Artemis did not stand apart from the strife. When the Trojan hero Aeneas was struck down in the fight by Diomedes, Apollo took him from the clash and carried him to the high place of Pergamos, where his own temple stood. There, within the great and hidden chamber, Artemis, the one who showers arrows, worked beside her mother Leto to heal the wound. Together, they cleansed the hurt and eased his pain until he was whole again, fit to return to the defense of Troy. But the war drew in not only mortal champions, it also brought the gods themselves into open conflict. After the death of Patroclus, Archelaus returned to the field with rage in his heart, and Zeus gave leave for the gods to descend and aid whom they pleased. The fields of battle became the ground of divine contention. In the struggle that followed, Artemis faced Hera, the queen of the heavens. Yet in that contest the huntress did not prevail. She was struck down and beaten by the power of the elder goddess, and the clash of their wills was one more echo of the greater war raging beneath the walls of Troy, and woke the battle once more, and the gods themselves came down from their lofty halls to enter the fight. The plain of Troy was no longer the field of mortal warriors alone, for the immortals strode among them, taking sides as they willed. Ares, the god of the shining helm, went to aid the Trojans, and with him walked Apollo, the one with the unshorn hair, his bow glimmering in the light. Beside them was Artemis, the lady of arrows, swift and sure in on her step, and Aphrodite, smiling yet fierce in her purpose. Leto, their mother, came as well, and the river god Xanthos rose from his waters to stand with their host. In the midst of this divine contention, Apollo turned away from a challenge with Poseidon. Seeing this, his sister Artemis, the Wild One, lady of the wild beasts, rebuked him sharply. Her words were edged like the arrow she carried. She accused him of fleeing from the contest, of yielding victory to Poseidon without a true fight, and mocked him for the bow he bore, calling it nothing but wind if it served no use. She warned him never again to boast, as he had done in the halls of their father, that he could match the strength of the Earthshaker in combat. Apollo gave her no answer, holding his silence, but her challenge was not left unanswered for long. Hera, august and terrible, consort of Zeus, turned her anger upon Artemis. Her voice cut like a storm through the clamor of the field as she called the huntress shameless for daring to face her. She told her it would be folly to try to match her strength, bow or no bow, for Zeus had made her a lion only among women, with a right to strike down wild creatures at her will. Hera told her it would be better to return to the mountains and hunt the beasts that roamed there, rather than seek battle with one far her superior. If she wished to learn what true fighting was, Hera invited her to come forward and try. With that, Hera seized both of Artemis's wrists in her left hand, holding her fast. Then, still smiling, she struck her across the ears with Artemis's own bow. The arrow spilled from the quiver, scattering in the dust as Artemis twisted, struggling to break free. At last she slipped away, fleeing in tears like a pigeon darting from a hawk, finding safety in the hollow of a rock or the darkness of a cave, spared only because fate had not given the hawk her capture. Her bow lay abandoned upon the ground, the string slack and the shaftless tips left to glint in the light, and she fled weeping from the field. Leto, her mother, moved quickly to where the bow and arrows had fallen, gathering them from the dust where they lay scattered one way and another. With the weapons in hand, she returned to her daughter. Artemis had already gone to the bronze-founded house on Olympus, her steps quick, the ambrosial veil at her brow trembling with her breath. There her father, the son of Kronos, drew her close. He laughed softly as he looked upon her, and asked which of the heavenly ones had dared to treat her so, as though she had been caught in some wicked act. Artemis, sweet-garlanded and loud-voiced in the hunt, answered him plainly. She told him it was his own wife, Hera of the white arms, who had struck her down, moved by hatred, and in the long and bitter struggle of the Indian War, when Dionysus led his host against the armies of the East, the gods themselves took sides. Among them was Artemis, who stood as a champion for the hill-roaming god, setting herself against Hera in open battle. Hera, unyielding and full of cunning, had already sent the many-shaped Erinis to work her will, sowing madness in the mind of Dionysus and driving him into a frenzy. Artemis saw the god's eyes clouded and his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm, and she moved swiftly to drive away the madness. But before she could act, Hera cast down from the heights a burning brand, a weapon of blazing fire or lightning, sending it through the air with a heavy crack to drive her back. Later, when the gods met in full combat, Artemis stepped forward again, her bow raised, facing Hera across the field of battle. She moved with the speed of the hunt, her steps light as she drew arrow after arrow from her quiver. Hera, ready for the fight, reached up to seize a thick cloud from Zeus's own realm, shaping it across her shoulders into a shield no weapon could pierce. The arrows of Artemis flew in swift succession, each one striking the dark veil of the cloud, each one finding its place yet making no wound. The sky seemed alive with their motion, the shafts circling and settling like a great flight of cranes turning in the air, each following the one before, until the cloud was bristling with their tips. Still the shield stood whole, untouched by point or feather. When her quiver was emptied and no shot had found its mark, Hera struck back. She gathered a weapon from the very air, a rough and frozen mass of hail, jagged like stone, and with her strength she hurled it. The hard lump smashed against the bow of Artemis, splintering its graceful curve and breaking the weapon in her hands. Yet Hera did not end her attack there. She stepped forward and drove the missile of ice against Artemis's breast, the sharp blow striking through the skin. Reeling from the force, the huntress spilled the rest of her arrows upon the ground, the weapons clattering as they rolled away into the dust. In another time, far from the noise of war, Artemis found herself caught in a moment of sudden terror and fierce compassion. Her companion, the Titaness Aura, had been overcome by madness after the birth of her children, the result of a violent wrong done to her. The birth had been swift, so swift that it seemed Artemis's own voice, speaking the word, had loosed the womb. 2 children had come into the light together, but Aura, her mind twisted by wild fury, sprang up like a lioness with her crest bristling, her feet moving in restless circles. She seized one of the newborns from the ground and, in a frenzy, hurled it into the air. The small body spun headlong, falling into the dust, but before it could be saved, Aura snatched it back and, in a deed without mercy, devoured it herself. The archer maiden stood frozen for a breath, her heart struck with horror at the sight. In that instant she moved, swift as in the hunt, to take the second child from Aura's reach. She held the boy tightly, this unfamiliar and fragile weight resting in the crook of her arm. Without pause she turned and ran through the forest, her steps flying over root and stone, the leaves whispering around her. She did not stop, carrying the child away from the madness of his mother, bearing him deeper into the safety of the wild, his small life cradled in the sure hands of the goddess. She moved silently through the forest, searching for the signs and scent of Lyeos in the high places he loved, the slopes and hollows where he roamed. In her arms she carried the child of another, the newborn son of Aura, held close against her as she walked the shaded paths. The boy was light in her grasp, yet the weight of him was a strange burden for her, for she had taken him in haste from danger and now bore him away from his mother's madness. She carried him with care until the time came when, feeling the heat of shame at holding what was not hers, she delivered the child to Dionysus, her own brother, placing him safely into his keeping. There was another time when her arrows were not aimed at beasts of the wild, but at mortals whose pride had risen against the gods. In the halls of Niobe, 12 children lived in the fullness of youth, 6 sons and 6 daughters, all strong and beautiful. Niobe, filled with pride, dared to compare herself to Leto, the fair-haired mother of Apollo and Artemis, boasting that while Leto had only 2 children, she had borne many. Her words reached the ears of the twin deities, and their wrath was swift. Apollo, with his silver bow, loosed arrows upon the sons, cutting them down where they stood, while Artemis, the shaft-showering huntress, struck the daughters. One after another, the children fell in the palace halls, their lives ended by the divine shafts. For 9 days their bodies lay in their blood, untouched by burial rites, for Zeus, the son of Kronos, had turned the people to stone so none could move to aid them. Only on the 10th day did the gods of heaven come down to lay them to rest, the earth receiving their lifeless forms. Niobe, worn down by weeping, at last remembered food, though her grief remained unbroken. She wandered to the lonely places of Mount Sipylus, where the nymphs are said to dance beside the flowing waters of the river Acheloios. There the gods transformed her into stone, her form fixed forever upon the mountainside. Yet even in this shape, her sorrow lived on, for tears flowed endlessly from the rock night and day, as if the stone itself still mourned the loss the gods had dealt her. In another telling, she was given 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, and again her pride in her great brood brought her downfall. She proclaimed herself more blessed than Leto, whose children numbered only 2. Angered, Leto called upon her children to avenge the insult. Artemis loosed her arrows upon the females of the house, and Apollo struck down the males while they hunted together on Mount Coithaeron. In this account, all perished save for the eldest daughter, Chloris, who would one day wed Neleus. Some said 2 daughters, Amyclas and Melibea, survived, and that Amphion, her husband, fell beneath the arrows as well. Niobe fled Thebes after the slaughter, making her way to the land of her father, Tantalos, at Sipylos. There, grief heavy upon her, she prayed to Zeus, and the king of the gods answered by turning her to stone. From her rocky form, water streamed as tears that never ceased, flowing in the sunlight and the darkness alike. High upon the slopes of Sipylos she remained, the face of the crag bent downward as if in endless mourning. The waterfalls spilled over the cliffside, their sound like a wail that carried far along the valley. From the far-off Hermos river, the echo of the water could be heard, mingling with the sighing wind and the mist that clung always to the peaks. A veil of sorrow that the mountain never shed. She stands upon the high slopes of Sipylus, a figure both feared and pitied by those who pass. From far away, the rock of Niobe seems to be a woman bowed low in sorrow, her face bent, her form trembling with the weight of unending grief. Her sobs seem to echo against the cliffs, and from her downcast face flow tears that fall without ceasing. To those who pass at a distance, it is as if she truly lives, caught in the moment of mourning forever. But when one comes close, the vision fades, and there is no moving figure, no flesh nor breath, only the sheer brow of a great rock, a jagged piece torn from the heart of the mountain. Yet even then, the presence of Niobe is felt, for the stone bears her fate, the debt she paid to the wrath of the gods when her children were struck down by Apollo and Artemis, leaving her a heart shattered into the form of silent stone. Of all her daughters, only Chloris and Amyclas escaped the slaughter, spared by the mercy of Leto when they cried out to her in desperation. Their voices, raised in supplication, turned the hand of vengeance aside, and so they lived while all the others fell. But the house of Niobe was left desolate, and her husband Amphion, once a king and master of music, came to share her fate in dishonor. It was said that in the underworld, he endured punishment for mocking Leto and her children. His scorn for the goddess remembered beyond death. Niobe had been the mother of 7 sons and 7 daughters, each one fair to behold, the pride of her life. In the fullness of her joy, she let her pride swell into arrogance. She spoke often of her own fortune, saying she was more blessed in her children than Leto, who had borne only 2. Her voice carried not gratitude but boast, and the words turned sharp as she mocked the goddess openly. Leto heard, and her anger burned. She called upon her children to avenge the insult, and Apollo took up his silver bow to strike down the sons, while Artemis strung her arrows to bring down the daughters. Their shafts flew swift and sure, and in a single hour the house that had been so full was left in ruin. The end came swiftly. Apollo found the sons in the hunt upon the wooded slopes of Mount Sipylus, their voices carrying through the trees as they called to one another, unaware of the god who stalked them. One by one, the arrows found their mark, and the forest floor grew still. At the same time, Artemis entered the palace where the daughters were gathered, her bow in hand, her face set in the purpose of the hunt. The strings sang as she loosed her arrows, and the daughters fell in turn. Chloris alone was left alive, spared by the will of the goddess for reasons unspoken. Some said Niobe had also taunted the gods for their appearance, mocking Artemis for wearing the short tunic and hunting attire of a man, and Apollo for his long hair and robes. Her words were filled with scorn, and in her pride she saw no end to her own fortune. But when the arrows had flown, the woman who had counted her children as her wealth stood stripped of them all. She was, in the same breath, both blessed with children and childless. In the end, she left Thebes and wandered back to the land of her father, Tantalos, in Sipylus. There she lifted her voice to Zeus himself, and her prayer was answered in a form she could not have foreseen. Her body became stone, her shape fixed into the face of the mountain. Yet her grief was not stilled, for from the rock there flowed an unending stream, the tears of Niobe that fell in daylight and darkness alike. The shepherds who tended their flocks below would look up and see the mist curling about the crags, hear the distant sound of water falling, and know it was her weeping. The Hermos River carried the sound far, mingling with the sigh of the wind, so that the whole mountain seemed to mourn with her. Those who passed along the narrow paths at the base of the cliffs, their steps quickened by awe and fear, would lift their eyes to the rock and see her still, Niobe, the stone woman, paying forever the price of defying the gods. On her wanderings, she carried herself with the pride of a queen and the certainty of one whom fortune had blessed beyond measure. She looked upon her children, so many that they seemed like a living army, and she counted their number against that of another mother. She bore 14 in all, 7 sons and 7 daughters, and her mind measured her womb's worth as 7 times that of Leto, who had brought forth only 2. She called herself happy, and in her arrogance believed her happiness could never be taken. even if fate should claim some of her brood, she thought, she would still have more than the mother of the twin gods. She scorned the thought of ever being reduced to the state of having only 2 children, dismissing it as near enough to being childless. Her words carried contempt as she told Leto to leave her presence and strip the laurels from her hair. The worshippers who had gathered for Leto's rites obeyed Niobe's command, removing the sacred wreaths. The ceremony was left incomplete, and the prayers that were offered were spoken only in silence. The goddess, far away, felt the insult as a wound to her honor. Upon the height of Cynthus, Leto turned to her children, Apollo and Artemis, and spoke of the shame placed upon her. She reminded them she had given them life and honored no goddess above herself save Hera. Yet now her divinity was questioned, her altars left deserted, her shrines abandoned. Worse still, Niobe, daughter of Tantalus, had not only defied her, but exalted herself above her, calling her childless and setting her own children in higher esteem. Leto's voice trembled with the weight of her grievance, but before she could speak further, Apollo's eyes hardened and he said, there was no need for more complaint. Artemis agreed, their resolve unshaken. Without delay, they wrapped themselves in a shroud of cloud and swept down from the heavens, their steps silent as they descended upon the citadel of Thebes. There Apollo bent his bow and loosed his arrows, striking down the 7 sons of Niobe. One by one they fell, swift as the shafts that pierced them, their strength undone in an instant. Niobe stood before the bier of her sons, her face pale, her heart torn, but her pride still unbroken. She called out to Leto, her voice bitter, telling her to feast on the sight of her grief, to glut herself on the ruin she had caused. Even so, Niobe's words were steeped in defiance, for she still counted her remaining daughters as proof that she was richer in children than her rival. Yet as her voice rang out, the twang of another bowstring split the air. Fear spread through all who heard it, but Niobe did not flinch, her pride refusing to yield. Her daughters stood together in black robes, their hair unbound, their faces shadowed with mourning. They were gathered beside the biers of their brothers when the arrows of Artemis fell among them. One gasped as she pulled an arrow from her side and fell with her cheek upon her brother's lifeless form. Another, who had reached to comfort her mother, suddenly crumpled without a word, struck by an unseen wound. One tried to run but stumbled and fell before she could escape. Another died in her sister's arms. One hid herself in terror, and one stood frozen where she was, trembling as if the air itself had turned to ice. 6 daughters perished, each claimed by a single strike. Only one remained, the youngest. Niobe threw herself over the child, covering her with her body and her garments, begging for her life. Her voice, once sharp with pride, was softened by desperation as she pleaded to be spared this last loss. But even as she begged, the final arrow struck and the girl fell. Niobe was left amid the bodies of her sons, her daughters, and her husband, all taken from her. Her voice was stilled, her eyes empty of all but grief. In her desolation, she was changed into stone, fixed upon the earth. Yet her sorrow did not end. From her hard form the tears flowed still, day and night, an unending stream that bore witness to the ruin wrought by the wrath of the gods. She spoke of vengeance as one who knew its weight and its justice, saying that if another woman dared to bring harm as one once had to her mother, she herself would rise as the avenger of the archeress's honor. Artemis answered, her voice steady, speaking to the goddess who brings deliverance from evil, and said that she too had endured what her mother endured, that their fates were alike. In Phrygia, Niobe had dared to offend Leto, the mother of twins, and in that same land the impious Aura had wronged Artemis. Niobe had paid for her insult by taking on a form not her own, transformed into the changeless shape of stone, a daughter of Tantalos, whose many children had been the cause of her grief. And even now, she wept with eyes that could never close, the unending tears of cold marble. There was yet another who had felt the sharpness of Artemis's wrath, the giant Tityos, in the land of Panopea. He met his end when Artemis loosed the deadly shafts from her unyielding quiver. The arrows flew swift and sudden, bringing death before he could take another step. His crime had been great, for he had dared to lay hands on her mother, Leto, when she came to Pytho. In his desire, he reached for her, but she cried out to her children, and both Artemis and Apollo answered. Together, they drew their bows and struck him down, ending his mortal arrogance. Yet his punishment did not end with death. In the realm of Hades, Tityos lay stretched upon the ground, his heart forever prey to the tearing beaks of vultures, a torment without rest, a warning to all who would pursue loves beyond their reach. She was named the Slayer of Tityos, the Lady of Maidenhood, whose arrows spared neither giant nor man who crossed her in defiance of her honor. And Nemesis herself had asked her if Tityos had risen once more, rolling his maddened eyes and daring again to touch the robes of the untouchable Leto, urging Artemis to take up her bow and call upon the arrows of Apollo. There was also the time when the great serpent Python had felt the vengeance of the divine twins. This dragon serpent, dwelling in the region of Delphoi, had known that Leto carried within her the children of Zeus, and through the malice of Hera, it had sought to destroy her before they could be born. From land to land it pursued her, shadowing her every step, until by the will of Zeus the north wind carried her away to Ortygia. There, clinging to the branches of an olive tree, Leto gave birth to Apollo and Artemis. Hephaestus, in honor of their birth, placed into their hands the weapons they would bear all their days, arrows swift and sure. It was only 4 days after they had come into the world when Apollo rose to avenge his mother. He journeyed to the slopes of Parnassus, and with his new bow he slew the python, ending its long reign of terror. Artemis stood beside her brother in that act, sharing in the justice that fell upon the beast. And afterward, the twins sought purification for the killing, though some refused them entry, and they found welcome instead with Carmona in Crete. And there were the Aloidai giants, whose strength was great and whose ambition knew no measure. These sons of Poseidon had sworn to overthrow the very gods themselves, to storm the heights of Olympus and take the thrones of the immortals. They sought to lay hands on Artemis, thinking to claim her as a prize, but she, with the cunning of a huntress, outwitted them. Some tell how she changed her form into that of a deer and leapt between them. Blinded by their rage and each thinking to strike the animal for himself, they turned their weapons upon one another, and thus they fell by their own hands. In this, her arrows were not needed, for her swiftness of thought and the turning of their own might against them became her weapons. The Aloides' great plans perished in that moment, and their bodies lay upon the earth they had sought to rise above. Thus time and again, Artemis stood as the swift hand of retribution, her bow unerring, her mind clear, and her resolve unshaken. Whether against women who mocked her and her kin, against giants whose pride led them to ruin, against monsters sent by malice, or against those who threatened her mother, her justice was always the same, quick, certain, and without mercy for those who had brought offense. Poseidon lay with Iphimedea, and from their union were born 2 sons, Otos and Ephialtes. known together as the Aloidai. These brothers were no ordinary mortals, for with each passing year, their size increased beyond all reason, 2 feet broader and 6 feet taller with every turn of the seasons. By the time they reached only 9 years of age, they already measured an astonishing 18 feet across the shoulders and 54 feet in height. Their strength matched their size, and with it came an ambition that dared to challenge the very gods. In their boldness, they conceived a plan to storm the heavens themselves. They heaped Mount Ossa upon the peak of Mount Olympus, and upon Ossa they placed Mount Pelion, building a stairway of mountains to climb into the sky. Their purpose was nothing less than to reach the dwelling place of the immortals and overthrow them. But ambition was not their only folly. Ephialtes, in his arrogance, set his desire upon Hera, queen of the gods, while Otos directed his longing toward Artemis, the maiden huntress. Such pursuits could not end well. Artemis, unwilling to be taken, resolved to end their threat not with brute force, but with cunning. On the island of Naxos, she took the shape of a swift deer and darted between the towering brothers. Consumed by their eagerness to strike the creature, each hurled his spear toward it, and in their haste they struck one another. Thus the Aloidai, so great in strength and stature, fell by their own hands, undone by the trick of the goddess they sought to claim. Others tell the tale differently, saying the brothers were not merely strong, but invulnerable, born of Poseidon and Iphimedea, and could not be overcome in direct combat. In this telling, they too pursued Artemis, their strength so great that she could not match it in open struggle. Then Apollo, her brother, sent a deer running between them. Anger blinded them, and in their wild attempt to pierce the animal with their javelins, they struck each other down. Yet even in death, their punishment was not finished. In the underworld, the two were bound back to back against a single column, their bodies entwined with serpents. Between them perched a screech owl, the bird that feeds on blood, watching them in their torment. Nemesis herself once spoke to Artemis of them, asking if it was again Otos or Ephialtes, bold and boastful, who sought her love though it lay forever beyond their reach. She urged Artemis to strike down any who dared such presumption, to protect her unwedded state from those who would defile it. There was also the fate of Actaon, another who felt the wrath of Artemis. Born to Orthnoi and Aristaeus, Actaeon was reared under the care of Chiron, the wise centaur, and from him learned the skill of the hunt. In time, he became a great hunter, roaming the wild slopes of Mount Kithaeron with his hounds. But his life was to end in a manner as strange as it was terrible. In the common telling, his doom came when he wandered into a secluded place and beheld Artemis bathing. To see the goddess thus, in a state that no mortal man was meant to witness, was an offense she could not forgive. Her response was swift and merciless. She transformed him into a stag, stripping him of speech and human form. In this new shape, Actaeon fled through the woods, but his own hunting dogs, loyal to the scent of the chase and not recognizing their master, gave pursuit. They brought him down as they would any quarry, their teeth tearing into him until nothing remained. The hunter had become the hunted, and his skill in the chase had only hastened his end. The chorus of archer maidens, the Toxotais, who served Artemis, would tell the tale as a warning, for in it was the lesson that the goddess's boundaries were not to be crossed, whether by giants or by mortal men. They say that the goddess transformed him instantly into a deer, his human form vanishing in a moment, replaced by the delicate legs and slender body of the wild creature. His mind remained his own, but his voice was lost, and his hands were now hooves that could hold no bow. Then, with a will of her own, the goddess stirred his 50 hunting dogs into a madness they could not resist. They did not see their master before them, only prey. With howls echoing through the hills and bays that rolled like thunder, they rushed upon him, teeth flashing, eyes bright with the fever of the hunt. Surrounded, there was no escape, and though he fought to flee, his speed could not save him from the relentless circle that closed in from every side. The dogs brought him down, and before long, there was nothing left of the hunter they had once followed. When it was over, the frenzy left them and confusion settled in. They searched the hills, calling with their voices and lifting their noses to the wind, trying to find the scent of the master who would never call them again. Their search brought them to the cave of the wise centaur Chiron, who, knowing what had happened, took pity on them. To soothe their grief, he crafted a likeness of Actaeon, so that they might look upon the image and feel again, in some small way, the presence of the one they had lost. It is told that long before his fate was sealed, the parents of Actaeon, his mother, the daughter of Cadmus, and his father, Aristaios, had made many offerings, praying that they might keep their only son safe. And yet, no sacrifice could change what was to come. Though Actaeon would share the hunt with Artemis, roaming the wild hills at her side, neither the joy of the chase nor the closeness of that company would spare him in the hour when he would, without intending it, look upon the sacred bath of the goddess. In that moment, the bond between them would mean nothing, and his own dogs would fall upon him. His mother would be left to walk the thickets alone, gathering what remained of his bones, piecing together the son she could no longer hold. On the road from Megara across Mount Kithaeron toward Plataea, there is a spring, and not far from it a rock they call the bed of Actaeon. It is said that there he once lay down, weary from the hunt, and there he looked into the waters of the spring where Artemis was bathing. Some say that the goddess cast a deerskin about him to ensure his hounds would kill him, wishing to stop him from taking Semele as his wife. Others tell it differently, claiming that without any act of the goddess, his hounds were struck by madness and would have torn apart anyone they met. There are those who say the cause of his death was not chance, nor simply the sight of the goddess, but his own arrogance. In one telling, Actaeon, proud of his skill, offered the first fruits of his hunting to Artemis, yet at the same time planned to wed her in her own temple, forgetting that she belonged to no man. In another, he claimed himself the greater hunter, placing his skill above hers, the very goddess before whom even gods do not dare compete in the chase. Whether it was for one reason or both, it is agreed that the goddess's anger was just, and when the change came upon him, turning him into a creature of the forest, his fate was sealed. In that shape, the hunter became the hunted, and those who had once followed his call brought his life to its end. In his time of prosperity, the grandson of Cadmus became the source of his family's deepest sorrow. His young brow, once unmarked, sprouted strange antlers, and his own hounds, faithful to him in life, were sated with his blood in death. Some say the fault lay not in guilt but in misfortune. For what crime is there in losing one's way? On a mountainside, where the thickets and hollows bore the marks of many kills from hunts past, the day had already seen much success. The sun at noon had narrowed the shadows, and his blaze reached the heart of the woods. At this time, the young hunter, satisfied with the day's work, called to his companions, who still roamed through the lonely glades. Their nets hung heavy with the damp of the hunt, their javelins stained with fresh blood, and they had more than enough to call the day a triumph. He told them they would hunt again, when the dawn, in her saffron chariot, returned to light another day. For now, the sun's strength was at its height, its heat cracking the dry ground, and the time had come to end their labor. The men obeyed without question, gathering their nets and resting from their work. There was a valley there, cloaked in thick woods of pine and cypress, a place called Gargafi, sacred to the chaste goddess of the hunt. In the farthest and most hidden part of this grove lay a cave, enclosed by the trees, where a spring bubbled clear and cold. This spring fed a pool, its water shining in the filtered light, its surface untroubled except by the faint movement of the stream. Here the goddess, wearied from the chase, came to refresh herself. This was a place untouched by men, known only to the goddess and her maidens, a place of stillness where no hounds barked and no arrows flew. But on that day, by the working of fate, the hunter came to this sacred place. He was not in pursuit of game, for the hunt was over, and he sought only to cool himself and the dogs that had run with him through the morning's chase. In the silence of the woods, he entered the grove and stepped toward the spring, unknowing of the goddess within. There she stood, divested of her quiver and bow, her maidens attending her as she bathed in the clear water. In that instant, the stillness was shattered. She, seeing the mortal gaze upon her in her nakedness, was filled with anger, not for injury done by his hand, but for the offense to her chastity. She reached for water from the pool and flung it upon him, speaking no word. At her will, his body began to change. Horns burst from his brow, his neck lengthened, and his limbs became those of a stag. His garments fell away, replaced by the coat and sinews of the deer. His voice was gone, and where once he could command his hounds, now only the cry of the hunted beast came forth. Terror seized him, and he fled through the trees, the antlers heavy on his head, the strange new strength in his legs carrying him swiftly, but without hope. Then the hounds, his own loyal pack, caught his scent. They did not know their master, only the prey before them. They surged forward with wild cries, the forest echoing with the sound of their pursuit. Melampus, swift of foot, led the charge, followed by Icnobates with his sure nose to the ground. Ecnobas, Pamphagos, Dorceus, Oribasus, Nebrophonus, Laelap, and many more ran close behind, their eyes fixed on the fleeing form. From every side they came: Theron, Pterelus, Hylaeus, Nab, Laden, Poemenes, Lacon, Aiello, Dromas, Cyprius, Stycte, and countless others whose names were known to the hunter, but whose loyalty could not be called back. The air was filled with their panting breath, the pounding of their paws and the snapping of branches as they closed in. He leapt over roots and rocks, sought the steep slopes, and tried the winding paths, but there was no escaping them. They had hunted with him through every season, and now they hunted him with the same relentless skill. The first teeth tore at his flank, and more followed, bringing him down in a rush of fur and snapping jaws. The struggle ended swiftly, the pack surging over him until his cries faded and the forest returned to silence. When the frenzy passed, the hounds searched for their master, not knowing that the prey they had brought down was the one who had led them so often to victory. They called for him with howls that rose into the air, but no answer came. They wandered in confusion, until at last they came to the cave of Chiron, who, knowing the truth, took pity on them and made an image of the hunter, so they might grieve beside a likeness of the one they had lost. The cave lay hidden deep within the grove, untouched by human hands and shaped instead by the patient work of nature. The living limestone had been carved by time into a perfect arch, and from its shadowed depths, a clear spring bubbled forth, its sound a soft and constant murmur as it poured into a broad pool below. Around its edge grew a bright green ring of grass, fresh and soft beneath the feet, nourished by the flowing water. This was a place beloved by the goddess, a sanctuary after the rigors of the hunt, where her maidens would bathe her in the cool, pure waters. When she arrived at the cave, she handed her spear, her quiver, and her unstrung bow to one of her attendants. Others stepped forward to receive her garments, holding them with care across their arms. Two knelt to remove her sandals, freeing her feet from the dust and strain of the chase. Krokal, with skilled fingers, gathered and tied the goddess's hair loosely into a knot so that it fell softly over her shoulders, even as her own hair tumbled freely. Then Nephele, Hyale, Ranis, Vial, and Tsekas came bearing brimming jars of water, pouring the cool stream over her with gentle hands. The goddess stood in the pool, the water flowing over her skin, surrounded by the peace of her sacred retreat. But fate, in its unyielding design, had guided another to this hidden place. The grandson of Cadmus, the hunt for the day complete, wandered without aim through the forest's unfamiliar paths. In his aimless steps, he came upon the grove, drawn by the quiet murmur of the spring and the cool shadow of the arch. Passing between the trees, he entered the sanctuary and beheld the cave. At once, the maidens saw him. Shocked to find a man before them while they stood unclothed, they cried out, their hands striking their breasts, their voices rising in alarm. Their screams echoed through the grove as they rushed to shield the goddess with their own bodies. Yet she stood above them all, her stature taller by a head, her presence commanding. The flush of sudden anger and shame spread across her face, deep and vivid, like the crimson that colors clouds at the setting of the sun, or the glow that rises at the dawn. She turned her head over her shoulder to look back at him, wishing in that instant she had her arrows at hand. But the only weapon she held was the water itself. In one swift motion, she scooped it up and flung it full into his face. As the stream drenched his hair, she spoke a single sentence that carried the weight of doom, that if he could, he might tell of seeing her unclothed. Even as the water ran down his face, the change began. From his head rose great antlers branching wide. His neck grew long, his ears sharpened to points. His strong hands became hooves, his arms lengthened into slender legs, and across his body spread a hide mottled with dappled markings. At last, she placed within him the deepest terror, a fear that seized his heart. He turned and fled, the once royal hunter now a beast, and he marveled at the speed of his own leaps. But when he came to a stream and saw his reflection, he knew the truth of his ruin. The antlered head that stared back was no longer his own. He tried to cry out in despair, to speak his grief, but no words came, only a low groan, the voice of a creature. Tears slid down a face no longer human, yet his mind was unchanged. He stood in torment, torn between fleeing deeper into the forest or returning to the home that was now barred to him by shame. As he hesitated, his hounds caught sight of him. Melampus, the Blackfoot, and Ichnobats, the Cretan tracker, were the first to give voice, their cries sharp in the still air. The rest surged forward in a rush, swift as the wind. Dorceus the Glance, Pamphagos the Glutton, and Orobasus the Ranger came from Arcadia, joined by fierce Nebrophonus the Rover, sturdy Theron the Stalker, and stormy Laelaps. Pteralus the Flight, unmatched in speed, bounded ahead, with Argre the Hunter close behind, her nose keen for the scent. Hylaeus the Woodman, still bearing the wound of a wild boar, and Nape the Dingle ran with the pack, their eyes fixed on the fleeing shape. The hunt had begun again, but this time The hunter was the prey. A slender bitch, sired by a wolf, ran with the pack, her lean frame cutting through the undergrowth. Poemenes, called Snatch, ran with her 2 eager pups at her heels. Gaunt Harpia of Sicyon, known as Catch, loped forward with long, tireless strides, and Ladon the shepherd, once guarded flocks with watchful eyes, now hunted his own master. Dromus the Spot, swift in every turn, was there, as was Kanak, the Gnasher, whose bite could break bone. Tigris, fierce as her name, dashed ahead, followed by Styx, the courser, and Alci, the strong, each bounding with relentless energy. Asbolos, the dark-coated sooty, charged through the brush, while Lucum, white as winter snow, ran with her, the brightness of her coat flashing between trees. Lysish, the wolf, sped beside his nimble brother Cyprius, the Cyprian, both moving as though one body. Lacon, great and sturdy, the Spartan, thundered after them, and Aiello, the Tempest, whose limbs never tired, raced at his side. Thors, called Clinch, his dark brow crowned with a single white star, came behind them, while Melaneus, the Blackie, pressed forward in the chase. Harpalos, rough-coated and wild, bounded over the rocks, and with him came Labros, the Fury, and Argiodas, the White-Toothed, both the offspring of a Cretan sire and Spartan dam. Hylacta, the noisy barker, filled the air with her sharp cries. Many more, too many to name, thundered behind, their baying a chorus of death. The pack was hot on the scent, their master turned prey, and they gave him no rest. Over the rugged fells and across jagged crags they drove him, through narrow passes and open hillsides, over paths marked and unmarked. He fled through places where once he had given chase, now hunted instead of hunting. He wished to cry out, to call to them and say he was Actaeon, their master, but his voice had been stolen. His mouth could no longer form the words, and only the hound's baying rang through the wild. Melanchides, the black hair, was first to strike, sinking his teeth deep into the haunch. Theridamas, the killer, followed close behind, biting with savage force. Oresitrophus, the climber, leapt upon his shoulder, his jaws clamping down. These had started late, but cutting across the hills, they gained the lead, their speed and cunning placing them at the front of the kill. They held him fast until the rest of the pack caught up. Then, all together, they closed in, sinking their teeth into the flesh they had so often guarded. He screamed, a sound torn from him in agony, a cry that was neither wholly human nor wholly the voice of a stag. It rang out over the mountainside he knew so well, echoing across the slopes, carrying into the air. On his knees, he turned his head from side to side, a mute plea in his gaze, but no mercy was found. His friends, who had once hunted beside him, were now urging the hounds on, their voices glad, cheering for the kill. They looked around for Actaeon, each calling his name, thinking him absent, slow to join in the chase. Hearing his name, he turned his head toward them. Would that he were truly absent, unseen in some far-off place, only watching. But he was here, and he was feeling every bite, every tearing wound. All around him the pack worked their savage task, their teeth ripping deep, the stag there was no stag falling beneath them. Wounds multiplied until his strength was gone and his lifeblood poured into the earth. Only then, when the body that had once been Actaeon lay still, was the anger of the chaste goddess satisfied. And when the tale spread among men, it stirred division. Some called her vengeance too harsh, too cruel. Others praised it as the rightful defense of her purity. And so the story passed into memory, carried by voices that could not agree, yet all remembering the day the hunter became the hunted. In that same pool, The goddess of stern and unyielding chastity had once bathed her untouched limbs, the place forever marked by her presence. It was there, in the stillness of those sacred waters, that the tale of another transgression was whispered, a tale told by Nonnus of a man who dared to defy her sanctity. He told of how the hunter climbed high into a tree, seeking to gaze upon the archeress's form with bold and unworthy eyes. The naiads, startled from their calm by this intrusion, cried out together in alarm, their voices breaking the peace of the grove. Loxo's voice rose sharply in warning, joined by Upis, their words echoing in unison. They moved quickly to halt their sister Hekaerga, who swam unaware in the calm stream, from becoming exposed to the same gaze. The sanctity of the place had been violated, and the cry of the nymphs carried through the quiet glen, sealing the hunter's fate. But the goddess's wrath was not confined to this single moment or to one man alone. It was said that Apollon and Artemis, in the time when their mother Leto bore them and wandered across the lands, visited punishment upon all who turned her away in her time of need. They travelled across every land, seeking those who had shown her no kindness when she came in her long journey. When they reached the land of Tegea, there was Skephros, the son of Tegetes, who came to Apollon and spoke with him privately. Yet suspicion is a poison that grows swiftly, and Lyman, another son of Tegetes, believed that the words his brother spoke were an accusation against him. In a sudden rush of anger, Lyman struck his own brother down. The crime did not go unanswered, for Artemis herself brought swift justice. Without delay, she loosed her arrow, and the shaft found its mark in Lyman, ending his life in retribution for the murder. There was also the tale of Bouphagos, whose name the river near Megalopolis was said to bear. He was called the son of Iapetos and Thornax, a lineage that carried strength and pride. Yet on Mount Pholo, his pride led him to a darker intent, for he sought to commit a deed unholy against the goddess herself. Such an act could not be left unpunished. Artemis, with her sure aim and unwavering hand, drew her bow and struck him down, ending his life upon that mountain. The river carried his name, a reminder of both his strength and his fall beneath the goddess's wrath. Even among those of great power, the goddess's arrows found their mark. There was Orion, remembered as a giant of extraordinary size and strength, born of the earth herself. From Poseidon, he had been granted the power to walk across the sea as though it were solid ground, yet even his greatness could not shield him. Eos, the rosy-fingered dawn, fell in love with him, and in her passion, she carried him away to the island of Delos. But such unions between goddesses and mortal men drew the jealousy of the gods. Just as they had envied Eos's love before, they turned their resentment toward Orion. Artemis, the chaste huntress of the Golden Throne, came upon him in Ortygia. There, with arrows loosed from her gentle yet deadly shafts, she struck him down. Some say it was her will alone, others that it was born of the god's jealousy, but the end was the same. The giant, who could cross the seas on foot, fell beneath the unerring aim of the goddess. So in these tales, from hunters and kings to giants and heroes, the pattern repeats. Those who wronged her, whether by offense against her purity, insult to her family, or acts of violence against the innocent, found the same end. The bow was drawn, the arrow flew, and the punishment was certain, swift, and final. There he was slain, though the reason for his death is told in more than one way. Some say that it was because he dared to challenge Artemis to a contest of skill, seeking to meet her in a discus match, a bold act that brought him no victory. Others tell that it was not sport but desire that doomed him, for he sought to force his attention upon Opis, a maiden from the distant Hyperborean lands, a virgin untouched and sacred. For such an act, the huntress's arrow found him swiftly, striking him down before his will could be done. In all the tales, the warning is clear. None who sought the maiden huntress's favor in such ways met with any good end. It was sung in the verses of Callimachus that not even the might of Otos nor the strength of Orion could win her in love. For those who dared to woo her brought about only their own destruction. To look upon her as one might look upon any other woman was folly, for she was bound to no man, her heart as untouchable as her arrows were unerring. There were those who spoke of how Artemis, in her own will, took Orion away from the sight of mankind entirely. In the words of Antoninus Liberalis, she removed him from the earth, from the company of mortals, and he was seen no more. In other tellings, it is recorded by Hyginus, it was when Orion sought to violate the goddess that she struck him down without hesitation. Her arrows pierced him, and his life ended in that moment, for such an offense could have no other answer. Another account places Orion in Crete, where he hunted alongside her. In that time, he boasted of his skill, speaking of the feats that he had accomplished and making proud claims of what he could do. It was said that his words overstepped their place, and for this too he was slain. Some say that before this he had lived with the Olympian in great closeness, and to show his dedication to the hunt, he made the same proud boast to Artemis herself. Whether by word or by deed, he overreached, and the huntress ended his life with her arrows. Callimachus also tells that when he sought to bring violence upon her, she struck him down. Yet because of their shared love of the hunt, his form was placed among the stars, becoming the figure of the hunter in the night sky. In the lines of Valerius Flaccus, the fate of Orion is told as that of one struck down by the cruel shaft of the virgin goddess. And now his shape is cast into the air, filling the space of chaos as a constellation. The poet Statius spoke of his son and the ill omen carried in the memory of his sire's death. For the grudge of chaste Diana was long remembered, an ancient wrong that still cast its shadow. And in the later words of Nonnus, there is the voice of Nemesis addressing Artemis, questioning what impious son of earth might again seek to harm her. She asks if it is once more Orion who uses force, the one who had dared to touch the goddess's garments and now lies lifeless within the earth, never to rise. If any man again should seize her with lustful hands, the call is made to bring forth another creature of vengeance, to strike and to protect the huntress's honor. Thus, through all the tellings, the thread remains unbroken. Whether it was pride, violence, or the presumption of love, Orion's end came at the point of Artemis's arrow, and his fate served as a warning that the goddess would never suffer such acts to go unpunished.